Good morning. I'm Eric Schumacher Rasmussen, the editor of Streaming Media Magazine, and welcome to our session this morning on latency and answering the question, how low should you go? Thanks for joining us here at our fifth Streaming Media Connect. We're all champing at the bit to get back to in-person events, but these virtual events have given us the chance to keep the conversation going while we're still apart. And if you're wondering, we are all systems go for Streaming Media West in Huntington Beach the first week of November. The program is live now. Our producer, Steve Nathans-Kelly, will post the URL in the chat, and you can check out the program and also look for the speakers, which we'll be announcing in the next week or two. Before we begin, I would like to thank our diamond sponsor for Streaming Media Connect, and that's Limelight Networks. Thanks to Limelight Networks for making this entire week of events possible. I'd also like to thank the sponsor of this panel, nanocosmos, and Oliver Lietz from nanocosmos will be joining this discussion on what continues to be one of the hottest topics in the industry. And as I said, that's latency. Oliver, welcome.
Hello, everybody. Thanks for having me.
Thanks for joining us. Good morning. Real quickly, if you do have questions for the panel, you can put them in the Q&A tab. The chat is open, but we do ask that you put questions in the Q&A tab, and we will get to them throughout the panel and at the end of the discussion. So with that, I would like to introduce Tim Siglin, the founding, I forget what your exact title is, Tim?
Founding Executive Director, Help Me Stream Research Foundation.
That's short. He's the Fed of Help Me Stream Research Foundation, which is doing some great things. And you know what, since we're asking all the panelists to give a very brief self-introduction, Tim, I'll pass it to you and just tell us a little bit about what Help Me Stream does.
Sure. So Help Me Stream started, there are a number of us veterans in the industry who know that we've sort of changed the way people consume content. And a couple of years ago, we started thinking about how to bridge the digital divide, especially in emerging economies. So one of the things we started looking at was whether we could collect old end-of-life servers, old tablets, old smartphones, laptops, and repurpose those into streaming solutions for NGOs and emerging economies. It turns out that really has caught attention from a number of people, and we're now also looking at doing that in disaster areas and rural communities, because COVID last year laid bare the fact that even here in the US, we have large swaths of the entire country that can't get connectivity, can't get streaming the way that you and I can enjoy it. So that's just a brief synopsis of Help Me Stream.
All right, Tim, and I'll pass it over to you to introduce the rest of the panelists and start the discussion.
Sure. Oliver, I'm going to start with you, and I know you have just a couple quick slides to talk briefly as sponsor about sort of where you define latency, because latency is a wide swath of time, you know, depending on where you sit in the process.
So my name is Oliver Lietz, CEO and founder of nanocosmos from Berlin. And we provide a complete integrated live streaming platform, which we call NanoStream Cloud, which is based on an ultra-low latency network with a unique player and additional tools like metrics and analytics. We own the whole workflow with our software installed on many servers on our content delivery network. And it's very easy to use NanoStream Cloud for your own live streaming workflow. You send a live stream to us, we do the delivery around the world, and you can play it with our player, which is running on all browsers. This includes live transcoding and adaptive bitrate to also adjust to hostile client networks and keep the user experience as high as possible. We license the platform for commercial customers for white label integration and custom web pages. nanocosmos has now been active in the broadcast industry for many years, founded in 1998, and we introduced NanoStream Cloud already 5 years ago. So let me share directly some typical examples of interactive live streaming, what we consider as interesting for low latency live streaming. Town hall with a podium discussion. This can be either based on a business meeting with a company or enterprise environment, or based on a public audience joining the discussion from anywhere in the world. So the target latency for this town hall meeting is 1 second to really enable the audience to engage and to interact based on Q&A, any kind of feedback the audience directly has to the presenters. We also more and more see this going to the virtual meeting space like we do now. So have the presenters in a virtual meeting room like in Zoom or Jitsi or the meeting applications, which then is shared to large audiences on a web page. Here's an overview of further use cases for low latency live streaming, webcasts, and town halls I already mentioned. A lot of use cases around sports betting, live auctions, and gaming, which directly have a monetized business model behind it. And also specific applications like live retail, where you do directly sales online. So all these applications have one thing in common, that they are interactive directly. You cannot go without any interaction. You require low latency to enable this interaction, and this must be around 1 second end-to-end, glass-to-glass. And back to the moderator. Thanks.
So I think that sets the stage in terms of latency. As Oliver mentioned, we've got latency we typically think about in the early days of streaming, and we've got latencies in the tens to low hundreds of milliseconds for interactive. I came out of video conferencing, so I lived in that interactive world for quite some time. It's a very good stage to set. Krystal, we'll go next to you. If you'll just introduce yourself briefly and tell us about your company and your time in the industry.
Sure. So my name is Krystal Mejia. I am a lead video engineer for ViacomCBS. I've spent all my time in video at ViacomCBS, formerly CBS Interactive, before there was that merger a few years back. I spent time working on live streaming and infrastructure specifically for CBS Sports Digital for a few years before I moved over to a platform team, the Video Technology Group. And the Video Technology Group were focused on advanced technologies for the broader ViacomCBS portfolio. So we work with various different brands and provide various different services. And one of the teams that I work on is the Origin team. And so we're focused on video packaging, manifest manipulation, services like that.
Okay, awesome. Thank you. And Robert Reinhardt, who shocked us all earlier today with not looking like his picture. Tell us a little bit about videoRx and yourself in the industry.
Thank you, Tim. Pleasure to be here. Again, my name is Robert Reinhardt. I've been in the streaming industry, I guess, ever since I've been working and had my own company in 1999 in Los Angeles. I started in Flash video. I wrote lots of Flash books and did lots of Flash applications around streaming video. And that was a great transition into HTML5 for me. I wasn't as upset as many when Flash went away. Today I continue to basically serve as I call myself a video solutions architect, where I basically troubleshoot and rethink people's streaming and deployment workflows. And so, low latency is definitely in the top tier of most of my work over the last couple of years, even before COVID. Cattle auctions, wine auctions, those are obviously an auction is something where you need sub 1 second latency if possible. Yeah, I'm really happy to be on this panel and contribute to the conversation. Thank you, Tim.
And you apparently got a shout out, Robert, from Tucker Snedeker, I believe is how he says his name, from the old mobile Flash team. So your fans are following you here.
Oh, thanks.
All right, so I'm going to go, Oliver, a question for you. So you deal with ultra low latency, where some others on the panel may deal with sort of low latency. How do you, what are the challenges of getting to ultra low latency? Because when we're talking about streaming at scale, and we start talking about throwing interactivity into that, what are some of the challenges that you face or that you find your customers face?
Sure. So first of all, ultra low latency is not easy, as video and digital video is not easy, as we all know. And really controlling the end-to-end workflow somehow is mandatory for these use cases, because one of the challenges is the whole delivery part, to be available on all devices, really in ultra low latency, and to control that from the ingest part coming from the camera. That can go, a lot of things can go wrong. Sending the stream upstream to a network and providing a platform which provides the delivery to all devices is really a great challenge. So that's where we invested a lot of work into, and we noticed that really it was very helpful to build that ourselves to have control on all software components. And also one important thing, we also learned that getting information from the players about their user experience, which is very important to get some business intelligence behind that. It was important for us to add metrics and analytics to the platform, which really helps our customers getting more insight into the quality of service of the whole workflow.
Now, Krystal, you mentioned that you were in live, and I know one of the things you had mentioned to me before we went on air was sort of the trade-offs you have when you're deciding on how much latency. Oliver mentioned quality of service and analytics and those kinds of things. Are those also important for your decisioning at ViacomCBS?
Yeah, I mean, for us, obviously low latency is important, especially when you think about what kind of live event you're streaming, but it's such a balance between latency, quality of the experience, and quality of service. And it's really hard, I think, to optimize for all three of these things. Usually depending on the type of event you're streaming, if it's sports, you start to put more emphasis on video quality, like how can we get HDR 4K content, which that's going to inherently add more latency to your stream, right? Versus maybe breaking news and you have talking heads at a studio, you can maybe give up a little bit on quality and focus more maybe on latency or the quality of service. And so we have to balance all of those things. And something that Oliver mentioned was, right, being able to control that whole end-to-end workflow. I think on the broadcast side, very difficult for us because we work with so many partners. And so being able to control all those different components in your video pipeline becomes problematic. And so all those different components, whether it's video ingest, the video player implementation, the encoding packaging piece, sometimes you have to start thinking about it, latency at those specific systems within the chain versus the full end-to-end, because it just becomes really difficult for us to manage all of that.
So Oliver, to Krystal's point there, how do you manage sort of the end-to-end? I understand you all have a player, as you mentioned in your intro. What other ways do you sort of manage that whole process?
Yeah, well, we have not only the player, but also the server software. We pick up the stream directly from the ingester, from the encoder. And I agree to Krystal that sometimes you don't have full control about what is coming to you as a network. But then it's important to have that bits and bytes together and control that. And based on the use case you would like to solve, then focus on that. And also what Krystal said was very much important, that you need to focus on what would you like to solve, what's your use case. Do we have a monetized business model behind that? Would you like to reach as many viewers as possible in a kind of lean back experience, or is it more lean forward, that someone interacts with you? So for these applications, which then more and more happen on mobile phones, you don't need a 4K signal. It's more important that it stays reasonable on the mobile device. You have additional elements on the application which enable your interaction. So it's very much dependent on what you would like to solve.
Particular use cases. That makes sense. So Robert, take us up to a high level view. I mean, standing here in the middle of 2021, what are sort of the low latency options that people have available today?
Yeah, I mean, generally speaking, and again, high level here, the options that we can use today, you have your traditional HLS, which is going to give you latency. You can get regular HLS pretty low. You can get it. I've had clients where I've tweaked it to get as low as 3 seconds, and that would include at scale using the right load balancing technology. You also now have low latency HLS, which is a little too bleeding edge. It hasn't really been fully put through its paces. It's still changing somewhat. I make the tech joke that I consider it like, I don't know if you all remember when pre-N came out for wireless home technology, like really, we haven't even ratified the N spec and we're selling hardware around it. And so, I always have clients coming to me wanting to use bleeding edge technology, but they never want to accept the fact that it's bleeding edge. And by definition, it's going to be rough on the edges, right? And it's not going to work in a lot of use cases that they want it to work. And then after that, after low latency HLS, when you want to get to more of the real-time transactions, nanocosmos, for example, has with NanoStream, They use WebSockets for a lot of the end-to-end low latency options. They also now are using WebRTC for their meeting platform, and it's well integrated into the rest of their options. Full disclosure, I did work with nanocosmos to review their platform a few months ago, so I'm well aware of it. I've worked with several CDNs over the years to evaluate their backends and give them my thoughts on it. But yeah, and so we got WebSockets, which has been around for a long time, and you can, it's just a binary transfer, but it is more responsive than you would get with HTTP. Pardon me. And then WebRTC for sub 1 second, and WebRTC does have some issue. I mean, so if you really need that low latency right now, we don't. Again, Flash was sort of there with RTMP back in the day, but now we have WebRTC that can utilize UDP and TCP. Again, trying to keep this really high level and quick. But for me,
that was a good pun there, Robert.
Yeah.
UDP and quick. Go ahead.
But yeah, if you're not familiar with the differences between TCP and UDP, UDP is a fire and forget type of protocol. They're augmenting WebRTC so that you can renegotiate lost packets even over UDP. But generally speaking, you're going to get, if you need browser compatibility, WebRTC is the way to go. Of course, if you have smartphone apps, you can be like Zoom, like we are here. They're using proprietary technology that's not WebRTC and still very low latency. So it really depends on those business requirements. If you read my column in Streaming Media Magazine, I always try to attack any problem, including low latency, with what are your business requirements, and let's go from there. Let's not look at the tech stacks that you have right now. Let's look at what you want to do and how you're going to get there most cost effectively.
Fair point. Fair point. So just a quick housekeeping thing for everybody. If you've got questions, you can put them in the Q&A part of Zoom here. Krystal, so Robert's talked about, from HLS down to WebRTC. What are some of the reasons to use HLS these days, even though WebRTC is faster from a latency standpoint?
Yeah, and I think Robert kind of hit the nail on the head there. It's all around your business requirements. And so for us, like as a broadcaster, right, our biggest commitment is to our partners, our advertisers. And so we have to start thinking about, when we stream an event, it's how do we need to scale that event? What support on the device side do we need for that event? The security concerns, is there revenue attached to this event? And so you start adding these components in the HLS chain, whether it's a DAI service, a DRM service, you need the reliability of TCP and HTTP, right? That TCP handshake becomes important, and even though that adds latency, we need to think about all those other business requirements. And so, right, as you start to add DRM, DAI, you have to be flexible, and you have to be able to take advantage of, I guess, technologies that have been tried and proven. Something Robert mentioned was like LLHLS, and it's bleeding edge. It's not really been put through the paces. And so for us, we can't really go after technology like that until we have, the reliability that it's going to be able to deliver and perform for us.
And not just that, having the players on the end that will receive HLS, low LLHLS, and know what to do with it as well. So,
right.
So, so we talked about Quick, Robert, and I know I sort of made a joke there, but Quick is the idea of taking UDP and making it as reliable as TCP through some tricks. And obviously it's part of HTTP3. What's your general sense of whether we're going to see adoption of that sooner rather than later? Do you have customers coming to you and saying, hey, help me figure out this HTTP3 strategy?
I do. And, like I said, last year, I did a lot of bleeding edge R&D for companies that were hoping to put those products to market, last year already. And again, I have to joke about historically, like I'll never forget, when I worked at Schematic as VP of Multimedia Applications, when I lived in LA, I worked with ABC, NBC, other broadcasters on different projects, and they didn't want to touch Flash until that Flash player adoption reached an insane high adoption, like 98, 99%. And they would want it to be backwards compatible to a Flash that was well established. And Flash, of course, got out there way more quickly than a browser update did, right? Because to update your browser, it takes some due diligence, especially in enterprise. But anyway, aside from that, it always astonishes me against that backdrop that clients are willing to, go after these marginal sects of or marginal portions of the demographic that, as Krystal was just saying too, with the business requirements, you need to satisfy so many things. And, if you try to tell them like, well, you're using this media server technology and it can't do negative acknowledgement with WebRTC. So you're going to have a poor experience if a person can't negotiate over UDP. If you fall back to TCP, we're going to have a higher latency. And they're like, well, why is that the case? And, I can't change the de facto situation with technology. So, again, I think today, I liken the problem with WebRTC is ultimately, I feel, scale. It's expensive to scale WebRTC, right? You can't just throw CloudFront in front of WebRTC and be done with it, right? Or some, huge CDN's HTTP edge technology to it. So it's expensive, but companies were willing to pay what they called the flash tax back in the day, because RTMP wasn't easy to scale either, right? It was real time. It was a lot more flexible with TCP, but I don't know if that satisfies your question, but it is, it's just difficult to, I find, get clients to really embrace what it means to be using bleeding edge today. Like, by definition, you're going after a less established audience than you are with something else.
And to a certain extent, it's the same problem we had with HTML5 video tags, quite some time ago, where we would, you always had to have that failover in place, as you say. So Oliver, as Robert mentioned, you focus on the WebSockets, WebRTC. How does scale come into play for you? And are companies uncomfortable paying a premium price because they got used to the flash tax, and from what I understand, WebRTC at scale is considerably more expensive, or at least has the perception of being more expensive?
Yeah, we noticed that the technology is not only not leading anymore for our customers, it's of course leading for us to provide the best solution to them. But we also needed to be competitive for a global scalable system for customers anywhere in the world, South America, Asia, wherever they are all price sensitive. So we do a hybrid approach. We embraced WebRTC early on. We decided to keep it on the ingest and broadcaster side, more browser-based live encoding. There are big challenges around that, also quality-wise. It's not really a high profile, it's more baseline profile. It's really meant to be used for video communication primarily, and not for such a large scale. So we also do this WebSocket approach on certain devices. We also do ultra low latency HLS based on our own protocols. So we keep that all from our customers, and we can scale very well with this solution and keep the price reasonable. So it's not something we keep unique as a premium service for our customers for ultra low latency. It's more like a standard service, and every customer gets that. So, and that's the expectation right now. And it's much more than implementing the technology bits and bytes. You need to provide a good user experience to build a player, and a distribution system based on these technologies is really very complex. So we learned our lessons, and it's something which usually works quite well when you do some prototyping in good networks, but it starts to get very challenging in hostile networks all around the globe when it comes to adaptive bitrate at scale and all these things. So, and that's things customers don't want to worry about nowadays. So they want to have something which they can embed on their web page. You see more and more customers coming from vertical segments which don't have any clue on digital video. They don't know what compression is. They don't know what an artifact is. They just want to embed video on their web page. And they also need to learn the lesson that you sometimes need to make compromises, so you can't stream a highest quality signal to a low-end mobile phone. But that's things that they want us to care on, and not them. They don't want to do that themselves.
That's a good point. So, Krystal, you've been involved in live for quite some time, and on the broadcast side with partners. Oliver was mentioning networks globally being potentially hostile, but also you've got a lot of legacy devices that you have to deal with and add things like DRM. What are some of the learnings that you've come away from doing that kind of work and finding on how decisions are made for what network or what partners require, say, in one part of the world versus everybody else in the rest of the world?
Yeah, I think the nice thing about being an engineer is you're more focused on the how things are done, and so you don't have to focus too much on those business requirements. Us on the platform side, we rely obviously on the brands, the business, to tell us what those numbers and metrics are. Really, all we can do is provide the data that says the more components we add to this chain, the more if latency is a huge target, they have to understand that this is how much latency we're going to be introducing. And so, you look at an event like, say, Super Bowl, where we start to make trade-offs and say, we're going to bypass DAI because we don't think we could even scale the DAI service to handle those many concurrents. We have the data to sort of show that, and then we can say, okay, we're going to try to figure out how to embed the ads in the stream and generate revenue that way. And so we start to look at other trade-offs, but ultimately, right, once the business understands their requirements, as an engineer, you can start to sort of look at all those different components and eliminate them from your video pipeline if needed, or optimize those places and look at redundancy in those places, regardless of it introduces latency or more latency or not.
I wanted to ask Krystal a follow-up on that, because you and I wear some similar hats. I do engineering as well, but because I'm a consultant, I wanted to ask, like, how often do you find that the people you're working with, whether they're partners, don't understand what their business requirements are, and you have to help inform them? Like, they'll come to you with some assertions thinking that they understand it, but they really don't, and what they're asking might be counterintuitive or counterproductive to what they want to achieve.
Yeah, and I mean that happens a lot. I mean right, we build a platform and we say we can do DAI, we can do DRM, we can do everything, and people think we'll just plug and play, and they don't understand, I guess, on output what the implications are, and even just on setting up events like of that nature. And so depending on your experience, and a lot of people really from a business perspective, they just understand data and numbers and don't necessarily understand the technology under the hood. And so really we do a lot of work to, I think, share knowledge here about the limitations we run against, because the ultimate thing for us is obviously reliability and the quality of service. And so we'll give up on video quality or latency as needed, all depending on the brand and their business requirements.
So Robert, we've talked about web browsers a little bit, plugging video into web browsers. Is that, we seem to shift back and forth in the industry to do it all in apps, do it all in, streaming appliances like an Apple TV or Roku or what have you, or do it all in browsers. Where do we sort of sit right now, considering latency, but also considering sort of the broader picture of where people want to consume content?
It's getting better, I guess, is what I could say in terms of, I would say right now, the vast majority of the clients I'm working with want browser-based technology. And I think that is based on the perception that, A, it's cheaper to maintain. I mean, overall, right? I mean, making sure that you're compliant with a wide range of browsers. I still have clients that do medical streaming, for example. It's a niche market, so they can force people to always use Chrome, right? Like, if you come to the site and you're a pharma rep and you are there in Safari, it's going to say, hey, you have to use Chrome. So in some ways, we haven't gotten there yet with people's safety level or comfort. The good news is, Apple was sort of the last sort of holdout for WebRTC, and it's funny because, like, just as a low tech example or low level tech, Safari supports VP codecs now, but only in WebRTC. You can't throw a WebM file in a video tag and have it play in Safari. They don't want you to do that. And so, there are, and that will probably change over time. Heck, it might have even changed while I'm talking. I don't know, but or a month ago. I haven't tested it, but anyway, aside from that, I do find that, that is one of the nice things about WebRTC. It is getting more and more established in browsers, and so therefore you can do this dev once, deploy everywhere kind of approach, so again, it's, I think, business requirements, and Krystal brought it up before too, and Oliver, with user experience. I mean, I think getting your pieces together so that they make sense. I mean, one of the things I really liked about working with Oliver at nanocosmos when I was reviewing their platform was that they were doing things in a really sensible way, which, you would hope happens more often than not. But, when it comes like this Zoom presentation, it matters that all of us have low latency, right? I want to be able to talk to you. You want to be able to cut me off or whatever. That's important. But the people watching this and even commenting on the chat, they don't need that low latency, right? Someone can ask a question right now and it can be delayed because we're in the middle of a conversation. Steve might pick it up and, bring it to someone's attention, but they don't have to be watching this broadcast in ultra low latency, right? And that's how nanocosmos has built their platform, right? Like if we were using nanocosmos for this, we would be doing this over WebRTC, but they've built it so that their ingest will automatically push out an HLS or WebSocket version of this that's much cheaper to maintain and enhance, and still give that quality of experience that people need in that situation. So I think that's part of the trickiness right now, is that figuring out how, and Krystal, you brought this up again too, like just getting all those parts working together so that they satisfy the business requirements. It makes fiscal sense the way you're deploying it. And, again, I think the hardest thing for me is when I get startups that want to offer a free version of their service as well as a premium version of their service. So like a freemium model. And they look at price tags like, oh, I don't want to pay $500 or $1,000 a month to a platform. It's just like, well, you realize your dev costs are going to be astronomical compared to just starting with a platform that is doing a lot of that for you anyway, right? So my latest column, which hasn't been published for streaming media yet, addresses this issue from a business perspective of just, put the thought into that process of like, what's your roadmap going to be around, and I didn't call it low latency in my latest column. I called it real-time interaction. Like what needs to be real time and what needs to not be real time, or just behind real time. So I think when you put it in different perspectives for clients and partners, it can help them start to understand what those problems really mean. So anyway,
No, that's very good. And I wasn't going to cut you off because you were saying pertinent things. So, but interactivity, I think, is one of the key takeaways we need to take away from this. When you're talking about ultra low latency, the interactivity portion of it, if it's video and audio like this, obviously it has to be very low latency. When it comes to things like polling or chat or questions, those things don't necessarily have to be. So Krystal, Robert mentioned that when he worked with Flash, it was 97% adoption of Flash before the broadcasters would look at it. Is there a model that says eventually somebody like ViacomCBS would do interactive? Because clearly you think about game shows and the ability to have people be part of that, live, maybe not necessarily with their video being shown, but obviously the latency has to be low enough if you got people around the country trying to all answer first or something like that.
Yeah, and I think, this use case has come up a bit, I think, when people start talking about like sports betting and what that interactivity is going to look like if it is an interactive component, because you're going to want to be as close to real time as you're sort of showing all this betting, gambling data right on screen, and whether users are interacting with that. And you've seen, I think, when you look at something like Twitch and how they're doing a lot of the interactive component work, clients are interacting with the broadcasters, not sure that you're going to be interacting with sports teams on the field, but are you interacting with broadcasters? Is there going to be a two-way communication at some point? I think sports is just content to me that I think is the biggest driver in innovation. And I'm curious to see if broadcasters start to dive deeper into an interactive experience in sports rather than just rely on a lean back experience.
Good. Good, good. So Will Law, who's those of us who've been in the industry for quite some time know very well, he's one of the architects at Akamai. He asked a question, and I'll throw this out to any of you. Can you comment on web transport as the planned evolution for WebSocket and RTC data channel for applications leveraging low latency transmission? Don't all speak at once.
Good question. Maybe it's too early to answer that because web transport is not available everywhere yet. And WebSocket is available everywhere, so it works. And the same for RTC data channel. It's also not working everywhere. So it very much depends what you would like to achieve. And I think it might be a future option for these protocols.
Do we get this solved with HTTP3? Do we have to wait that long, or is it something that maybe gets solved prior to that?
Yeah, I think it's also a bit early to decide. I think it's interesting that Google themselves, who basically invented or at least introduced WebRTC, they also are moving to things like web transport for their gaming platforms and not using WebRTC, which is an interesting sign, in my opinion. So there is a lot of development under the hood in these things, but these are still too early to adopt, in my opinion. So it takes a bit to have a full distributed availability on all devices. And maybe the other question, SRT, if I may answer my opinion directly, that's more non-browser based, so it might be interesting for ingest from professional backends, but it's not available in the browsers.
Robert, what are you seeing in terms of SRT adoption? Because obviously that's a hot topic as well.
Yeah, I honestly don't think SRT is going to evolve into this deployment mechanism. It certainly has helped some of the work that I've done with clients last year, particularly with ingest. I did a job with Reebok in a production company that worked with Reebok's CrossFit competition last year. And we had some pretty interesting tech requirements. I'm only going to go into this really quickly, but we were using a free application Lyrics broadcaster, which Softfellow makes. They've been at Stream Media in the past. But long story shorter, it was great. We were able to use SRT with HEVC. This is the problem with RTMP ingest and even WebRTC ingest is that while WebRTC is codec agnostic, so is WebSockets, so will be web transport. At the end of the day, you need to have those codecs somewhere so that you can encode and decode with them. But I think SRT will remain a player in the ingest for the foreseeable future, simply because RTMP can't do anything beyond H.264, right? And so, all the social media platforms are still using RTMP for live ingest because it's well established, it's available, all the hardware and software can work with it. WebRTC is going to be hard to do that with, right? I've tried to get the community rallied around creating more of a standards approach to WebRTC. What Millicast has sort of picked up that flag with what they called WIP, working with the people who created Janus to have a standard handshake. I mean, that's again, these technologies all sound great on paper, but even web transport, it's just a specification. At the end of the day, you still need to develop something around it that the industry will embrace, right? If I develop a web transport ingest that's very custom and proprietary, I'm not going to get Teradek and Asia to start building hardware around it, right? I mean, it's got to have and for better or worse, Flash did at least make RTMP standard enough. They opened the spec, and people sort of just gravitated to it at that point. I think that's good. So much looks good on paper right now. I mean, even HEVC, right? We don't have standard HEVC workflows yet, right? Because there's licensing around it. But you asked specifically about SRT. I don't think it's going to go anywhere fast. I think it's still going to be important for business requirements, some business requirements. SRT is going to be a great fit for it, but I don't think it's going to necessarily. I don't think I'm going to be playing SRT anytime soon. Every server config that I've looked at with SRT, it's a pretty complicated config, almost as complicated as WebRTC. So, if you want to start mapping ports for SRT, it gets you know, I always think of Flash and how when we did work with Disney, you know, invariably there was someone higher up who would complain that the firewall was blocking RTMP. Well, you know, so much has to update around these specs. If you're doing deep packet inspection and only allowing certain HTTP traffic through, then you could be dead in the water with so much of what we're talking about, right? And so, again, as I brought up with Krystal, making sure that everyone who's involved in the stakeholder pipeline understands the implications of what these tech stacks are bringing to the business requirements. Ultimately, you know, that's, you know, I don't want to be like the G.I. Joe cartoons when I was growing up, but knowing is half the battle. It is half the battle, if not more these days. But anyway, I went off topic there.
No. I was going to say, two key points you talked about there. One is SRT good on the ingestion side. And obviously there are a lot of forward error correction solutions from the ingest side that really help as you carry content in. I mean, we had Zixi on as a research keynote a couple months ago, and we talked about that topic in depth. The other thing is when you talk about the standards, and I think back to when I was in video conferencing, when we were dealing with, you know, very low millisecond rates, typically 70 milliseconds or lower, you had to have an ITU standard, you had to have an MPEG standard, and now we have to have an IETF standard, because when you're looking at things like WebRTC, it doesn't build, while it may use RTP and RTSP, it doesn't build on things like SS7 or SIP, which were the early ways to handle this. So in some ways, we're sort of reinventing the wheel, because everybody has their own proprietary solutions. We need to come to a standard. That's what I took away from what you were saying in that particular model. So Krystal, when we mentioned SRT, and sorry, Oliver, I'll come back to you in just a minute, but Krystal, when we mentioned SRT and forward error correction, you know, there's NDI as well, which is now sort of part of the conversation. Do you all find that from the ingest or origin side, you're having to rely on that kind of thing to bring content in from remote locations?
Yeah, and you know, ultimately it does depend on the remote location or the source that we're pulling that from. So we have some events, we've used Zixi in the past for ingest. You know, and it's essentially it was the best way for us to sort of get our stuff in the cloud. But even we tried to even eliminate parts of that chain where we had to bring in the source into the broadcast center before you even pushed it up to the cloud. And so for us, we always try to push back and say, how can we get closer to the source? Where are you capturing from? It's largely out of like our purview, because we're always focused from the broadcast side, the OTT side of the workflows, and we kind of work in parallel with broadcast engineers. And so some of our needs are a little different there. But similar to what Robert said, I think some of these, you do have to look at the ingest side of it, and SRT, you know, some of these protocols, you're going to see them more on the ingest side. I don't see how you're ever going to use that on output to the clients.
Oliver, I think you started to have a comment a moment ago.
Yeah, I completely agree what Krystal and Robert was saying. And on the ingest side, as a professional broadcaster, you have much more freedom. You can use professional protocols. You can use expensive stuff like whatever LiveView or Zixi, or newer things which are more open like SRT, which also still require professional live encoder software or hardware. So that's the contribution side, but the distribution side is the major challenge for the large audience. So to reach as many people as possible on any device, you somehow stick to the browser usually. We see more and more cases coming to the browser, and it's challenging, and we try to solve all these challenges, and I think we do quite well. I mean, it's interesting that we are now, what we are doing now, we are using, as all streaming professionals, we are using a proprietary platform like Zoom. It just works. You can log in, you can join it very easily, but the user experience is still limited, right? So you don't have the browser experience. You cannot combine that very well to your own branded environment. And so there are pros and cons, and there's still a bit to go to really work on these use cases going beyond the protocols. So really have a look at the application. What would I like to bring to the participants, and what benefit do I have, and how can I monetize that content?
So we're going to do one last round of questions, and Oliver, I'm going to start with you. What are some of the most interesting lessons learned out of these interactive or low latency use cases that the nanocosmos has faced?
Yeah, I think what I just mentioned, that most requests we get from business customers are browser-based. So it's not like in the last couple of years that many brands would like to create their own apps for mobile devices. It's a lot browser-based applications with instant access on any device. Whatever device you have, there are still some legacy devices on the market and newer devices which are more powerful. Any kind of network you have. That's a good learning for us, that these browser-based, module-based approach to combine things easily together for non-experts somehow to focus on the business model is very important. And mentioning the business model, you have to have a clear understanding of good monetization of your content. Otherwise, you might disappear very soon. So we have seen these things like HQ Trivia, quiz applications, things like whatever Periscope, which is merged with Twitter now, which have the power and value to make it free. But for small, medium, and even large environments and professional environments with revenue-based monetization, you need to have a clear understanding about how you earn money with the content.
So Robert, I'm going to come to you next with that sort of same question, most interesting use cases, but I want to remind the audience, we've got about 10 minutes left here. So if you've got questions that you want to ask, please put them in the Q&A. So Robert, what are some of the most interesting use cases you're seeing with low latency and lessons learned around those?
Yeah, I think last year was a good learning curve for not only myself, but clients. I mean, I certainly was working with WebRTC and clients wanting to use WebRTC before COVID, but it wasn't as critical as when COVID hit. And so people, and again, the end of life of Flash certainly accelerated the adoption to something, because you could pull off fairly low latency that was low enough for auctions to work. Like I built cattle and wine auctions with RTMP playback with legacy systems, and when clients put a ton of money into Flash Dev, even if it was 5 or 8 years ago, they wanted to maximize that for as long as they could. And so I would say, not every server technology is created equal. There's a lot more moving parts with WebRTC than there was with RTMP. I won't name names with server technologies because I don't want to get into that. But I definitely had to move clients that were using established media server technologies to other media server technologies because the WebRTC was too immature, I guess, if I was to use a word, in some platforms that hadn't fully developed it out than other, open source did. I mean, Oliver and with nanocosmos, they're transparent. I wrote it in my review of their service that they're using Jitsi on the back end, and Jitsi's open source, just like Janus is. Of course, all of these open source code bases now have a commercial licensing available with it too, if you want, the things that commercial licensing adds to the equation, like support, for example. You don't get support with open source just out of the box unless it's from the dev community. But I think the most interesting use cases for me are those that, again, make sense, that they don't try and do an all or none approach that I think, like so many things, when I do live streaming events pre-COVID, in person, now I'm doing more virtual tech direction. And I wanted to mention that too as a different aspect of low latency. Many of us that tech direct live events now have to have pretty, super low latency in controlling remote computers now, right? Because just before I left for the trip I'm on now, I was tech directing a live indigenous event stream for the provincial government using a vMix installation on AWS. And I had a very bad hotel connection at the time when I was traveling to do this. They knew it, so I had to plan lots of contingencies for that redundancy. I ended up using my hotspot on my phone because I was able to RDP over that to the instance much better than I could with even the paid hotel connection. And so, I think one of my clients is really big on redundancy, and I think it costs to have levels of redundancy, but I think that's the interesting thing with all these technologies is that you often have to, just like you had fallbacks with Flash too, you have to have your fallbacks in place, right? So if something doesn't work, you either have to make that incredibly clear to your stakeholders that all of these requirements have to line up in order for this experience to work. Otherwise, it's a no-go. I remember one of the first projects I did for Disney at Schematic, if you had under 800 kilobits, they just gave you a message saying, sorry, we're not going to dilute this experience for you to go to 250 kilobits. If you don't have 800 kilobits, you can't watch Lost or Desperate Housewives, right? Like it was just, they didn't want to ruin their brand, right? By giving bad video. And so, I think, having decisions like that acknowledged, I just find that, these days, again, people want the moon, but they don't necessarily want to pay for the NASA program to get to the moon. And so, but well, what are we going to do to get there and satisfy as many of these requirements? So, again, that's a bit of a departure from what you asked, but I would say the projects I'm working on right now that I find most satisfying are those that have simplified their business requirements to deliver a high-end user experience to the people that need to watch it. The most successful so far have been internal enterprise deployments. Like I'm doing something for a major game entertainment company right now, and all they need to do is share studio game shows with the corporate inside, right? And so, but in order to do that, they need low latency, they need super high quality. And so these are things that WebRTC can accommodate. Again, because they're not trying to reach the last mile of everyone, who's watching the game show, just the people who are involved with the production of it. I mean, there's a reason why Adobe just paid the money they did for, why can't I remember? What?
Frame.io.
Frame.io, thank you. I knew it was .io. I was going to say full-time. It was Frame.io. Thank you, Krystal. But, that's a very specific market. Like, I don't need everyone and their uncle to watch a Frame.io experience. That's a collaboration platform. And so I think the use cases, when when the business case requirements lines up with what that technology could do best, that's when I find it gets very exciting.
Got it. So Krystal, the quality of experience was something that Robert was alluding to here, and you talked about sort of the balance of QoS, QoE, et cetera. Are there minimum requirements that your partners have that that if somebody falls below a threshold, and especially with adaptive bitrate giving you some flexibility where you may choose not to deliver the experience as opposed to delivering a poor quality one?
We haven't had, I guess, too much of that where we haven't been able to meet like partner demands. I think where we come across that the most is obviously your Super Bowl scale events, because an event like that, usually the ask is for everything. How can we get dynamic ad insertion, DRM, 4K, HDR, all these kinds of things running, and it's a lot more difficult to do things like that. And so, we've luckily been able to sort of work together to understand, I think, from a business requirement and the engineering standpoint, where can we sort of meet in the middle? Because, as we've all alluded to, you can't have it all right now.
And you mentioned that you're trying to reduce part of your chain where you don't need to ingest stuff into the studio and then push it up to the cloud. A question came out from the audience that said, what are the thoughts around encoding at the edge to reduce latency versus shipping it into the cloud to encode? And that sort of gets to this hybrid model of, let's do our encoding here and push the different ABR bit rates up into the cloud to be delivered. Is there, and I'll ask you first, Krystal, but I'll open that up to Oliver and Robert as well.
So there's no we're not spending our time doing R&D on that kind of stuff. It still feels something that's not necessarily mature enough for us to say we're going to try this in production for some of the events we do, but we've certainly read up on a lot of those things. And so when we talk about earlier when I alluded to being able to capture directly from Stadium and ingesting that way, those are ideas that we want to sort of push through. And I think over the years, we're going to start to see more of that, whether it's a lot of our services, I think are going to start moving to the edge. There's been talk about like ad tech, all these kinds of things. Like how does it optimize the end-to-end chain when there are sort of all these different services running on the edge? And so I think you'll start to see a bigger push there, especially as CDN and edge compute becomes more popular.
Okay, all right. And I'm going to open it up to one of the two of you, Robert or Oliver, to answer that, because we've got another question I'd like to get to before the end.
I'll defer to Oliver on that.
Okay. All right. So we don't do encoding on the edges, but we do some kind of intelligence on the edges to keep the latency low. So there's a close connection between the receiver and the server parts compared to kind of passive modes in HLS and dash players. So there's some kind of intelligence makes sense, but very much depends on what you would like to do. And you might also introduce additional challenges here.
Okay, so there are actually two questions that have popped up. One is HESP. Do we see any future in that? Lower startup latencies and scalable continuous streaming deliveries. Anybody want to take that one?
I'll just say that it hasn't really come up with any of the problems that my clients have brought to me yet. So I haven't had one client with an HESP, technical requirement or where that would have fit in nicely. So it's similar to Dash for me. I find that in Europe, Dash is a much bigger audience for it, or there's a demand for it. I don't know if they just don't like HLS or what, but I would say every deployment I've done for North American and outside of North America has been HLS, just period, because it's become the de facto standard of streaming. Like, every platform has to support it, if they want to be, relevant, I would say. And so I'm not saying there aren't benefits to using HESP, and I've played with a little on my own just so I know what's going on with it. But to date, I haven't had any client come to me with an HESP problem, so I can't comment on it.
And then the final question here, what responsibility is it within sort of the whole interactive ecosystem to solve the bring your own device problem as it relates to viewers? I mean, Oliver, you mentioned you do things in web browsers, not really much call for apps, but what happens if you get a customer who says, I want to make sure that people can also look at this on a mobile device, and we have this app that we'd like to try to contain it within? How does that play out?
So if it comes to security, which is, of course, an important point for many vendors, there are several ways to solve that. So we try to do that with different approaches, working behind firewalls, allowing VPN access over HTTP ports as standard ports, and not make it too complex for the network admins, and also using kind of standard, industry standard access tokens like others do as well. So it's something which needs to be in collaboration with the vendor, and is usually specific to the use case. So there's not usually a one fits all solution for these concerns.
Okay, very good. Eric, I'm going to turn it back over to you, but I'd first like to say thank you to all our panelists for being here with us today.
Yeah, that was terrific. As always, you keep thinking that maybe someday the latency topic isn't going to be so top of mind, but it always is. So that was great hearing from a number of different perspectives on the role that latency plays. So again, yes, thank you to our panelists. Thank you, Tim, for moderating. Thank you to our attendees. And we do have a winner for the $50 Amazon gift card. And that is Jeffrey Longbottom. So Jeffrey, you will get an email from Streaming Media in the next day or so, letting you know how to get your gift card. So that wraps things up on the latency panel. We'll see some of you again, hopefully in a half an hour when we talk about moving your workflows to the cloud. Thanks again.